Hi friends, welcome back to Books and Ladders. My name is Jamie, I use she, her pronouns, and this is the place where we dive deep into stories rather than just skimming the surface of them. Today I'm going to be reviewing A Kiss of Crimson Ash by Anuja Varghese, which is a queer romantasy set in a lush, Indian-inspired world full of gods, political tension, magic, and a whole lot of spice. Thank you to Orbit Books for my gifted copy. I am choosing to review this book even though I was gifted a copy, and this in no way impacts any of my opinions on it. So let's get into it. I have a terrible cold, but the book comes out on Tuesday from when I'm filming this. So you're just gonna have to deal with that, I guess. And I'm gonna have to deal with it. So if there's a lot more cuts, it's because I'm sneezing and coughing. So apologies for that. If you like my reviews and the way that I analyze books, feel free to subscribe and or follow me on other social media. I'm very active on Storyograph and Goodreads, so you can always see all of my reviews there. A Kiss of Crimson Ash follows 4 characters whose lives slowly weave together against a backdrop of rising tension and ancient danger. We have Tara, a young queen raised in a matriarchal society who is suddenly thrust into a political marriage that threatens her autonomy and her kingdom's stability. Garjan, a hardened warrior with a mysterious past, is bound by duty but pulled toward desires he spent years trying to bury. Daya, a courtesan spy with sharp instincts and sharper secrets, moves through the world with both sensuality and survival in mind. And Roland, a foreigner with forbidden magic who finds himself entangled in conflicts far bigger than he ever expected. Magic in this world is tied to bloodlines, gods, and old bargains, and the balance between humans, elves, and divine forces is starting to crack. As political alliances shift and long-buried truths rise to the surface, each character is forced to confront what they want, what they fear, and what they're willing to sacrifice. The book blends romance, court intrigue, mythological influence, and high-stakes drama, all wrapped in a world that feels vibrant, sensual, and dangerous. It's the kind of story where desire and destiny are constantly at war, and every choice has a consequence. So first things first, I actually have bronchitis, so the cut between old outfit, new outfit, I started antibiotics. Doesn't matter. I think what I want to talk about first is kind of the overall vibe of this book, because it's really rich and colorful and dramatic in a way that feels really cinematic. I could see myself in every scene, and it was really lush with that world building and descriptions, which made you feel like you were along for the ride in the story with all of the characters, which was really helpful, especially because we're between a few different cities and places within this novel. So having those really lush and rich descriptions made it easy to know where you were based on how it was being described. And I would say that was the case as well with all of our POV characters. You always knew which character you were in the head of, in the space of. They were all really distinct, and you could tell what their internal monologue would be, their internal conflicts, what their goals were, how they were to interact with one another. I think sometimes it felt like the story was in the wrong place or within the wrong character's perspective for what should be happening, especially closer to the end when everybody was all together in one area. It really felt like some of the POVs should have been swapped around, because it would have made more sense to have different people meet one another for the first time or have those first interactions within a different perspective rather than the one that we got it in. And with that in mind, I obviously, and I think most people feel this way when there's multi-perspectives, but felt more connected to certain perspectives than others. I think Tara's perspective is the best out of all 4 of them, and I really appreciated Roland's perspective as well. But I felt as though Tara's was kind of like the lifeline to the entire story. And while I wasn't waiting necessarily to get back to her perspective, I did really appreciate being in her perspective. I think she brought the most insight, especially because she was almost like a new person in this world, because the other 3 knew one another, which I thought was pretty interesting. I think typically when you have these multi-perspectives in fantasy novels where everybody kind of has crossed paths and weaves together that typically either one or two characters knows one another or nobody knows one another. But really, Tara was the only one who didn't know anybody else within the story. She was really sheltered as growing up. She was introduced to all of this concept, and now she's being like thrust to the center of it all. And because of that, I think she had a really unique perspective that the others didn't, because she was learning new people, learning new things, interacting with people beyond her walls, which she hasn't really done, and also dealing with all of this magic and conflict at the same time. The other perspective that I really enjoyed was Roland's, because in my mind it mirrors Tara's perspective, as he's a foreigner who came to the land and had to learn something new, even though he was now already friends and acquainted with our other two perspectives. But I appreciated seeing things from his unique perspective. I do think, and I'm sure I'm going to use unique perspective a lot, so like, get over it. But I do think that there are times where his thought process felt a little repetitive, and wasn't always bringing or adding something new to the context of the story. And so because his was typically right before Tara's perspective change, I found myself trying to rush through some of those as well, which really kind of set the tone for when people are meeting Roland and what he gets to view from his perspective. I was hoping that he would have been more of the branch between the elves and everybody else, since he has kind of more of that connection, or it felt like he had more of that connection. But there was just not that same level of build within that character for what I was hoping, and I'm sure that will extend as the series continues, but I was just hoping for something more out of Roland's perspective. But this is a romantasy, so let's talk about the romance, because there are 3 unique pairings in this. 2 of our main characters are in a relationship with one another, and then Tara and Roland have separate relationships outside of the other characters. And I found that this is where the book really shined. It had its sparkle in these romance scenes. And I'm not just talking about the more explicit and spicy scenes, but in those tender moments of getting to know one another and really showcasing the bond and the intimacy between the characters, especially when we're looking at those queer stories with Tara and Roland, and just generally speaking, having the ability to want to showcase your love in that way. While I'll list all of the content warnings below, one that I do want to point out since we're talking about it is there's a couple sexual assault scenes or almost scenes that are on the page, especially between Garjan and Tara. That one was particularly triggering for me. So if that's something that can be triggering for you, just read this with caution or skip it, honestly. It didn't really add much to the characters themselves beyond just showing that there could be a breakdown of trust, and I think it adds to the idea of the world building and the magic for Garjan's character more than it had anything to do with, you know, the actual relationship between the two of them. I think it could have been done differently to get the similar point across without it being leading towards that assault element, but I still would just caution if this is something that triggers you. I think we need to talk about the world building and very explicitly the magic in the world here, because there seems to be some knowledge, obviously, of magic. There's elves. The elves have magic, and we're introduced really early on to the idea of different bloodlines having magic in them, and that's squashed down by the leaders in the world, so like the emperor and the kings. But it's not quite clear all the time who has what abilities and why, or what abilities are even possible to have. And that's why I think some of Garjan's character just isn't as developed, or that the scene didn't necessarily need to happen the way that it did between him and Tara. But I think that there's definitely some room to grow in terms of the magic system. It was really interesting. It was something that hadn't really been seen before. I liked the way that the gods were connected to the elves and what we're learning about the history and the lore for the world itself. But I felt like it was still too up in the sky for me at this point in time, where I'd really like to know more about the actual world, lore, magic, how it all kind of works together. It was very descriptive without describing anything at all. I really felt like the magic system was more vibes based than it was structure based, which can be helpful in a lot of systems. Like, I like when there's chaos to the magic in fantasy systems, especially as you're kind of like rebuilding a magic system, which it seems like they're trying to do in this instance based on like the lore. And I don't want to go into spoiler territory too much, but like, if the idea is that we're rebuilding based on being reincarnated as gods, then sure, that's great. We can have a little bit of vibes, but there still has to be some sort of structure, and it can't just be pure chaos. And we're kind of in pure chaos right now. And I think a little bit more time to develop some of the rules of magic and who's connected to what and why would have just really helped cement magic as a fundamental component to this fantasy novel. And really, like, the way that it was working was that it wasn't working. And I think that's kind of the key there, especially as we're seeing, like, half seeing training sequences that don't quite meet the standard of what you would want in your typical fantasy novel. But I want to be clear that I did really enjoy this novel. I think I am really looking forward to what happens next and the development of the characters and the romance. I think for a debut fantasy, this hits all the marks that I'm looking for. I'm just hoping for a little bit more development of the world itself and the magic system as we move forward for the rest of this series. I think this is a really ambitious and atmospheric fantasy novel. A Kiss of Crimson Ash came out on May 26th, and I highly recommend you picking it up. It's one of those books that tries to knock it out of the park, and I think it's doing a pretty good job of that, especially having those really queer normative characters, a big cast that has really interesting perspectives, and they're really good characters. Like, I liked being in their perspectives. I think that this is one that you'll really enjoy if you want to start to dive into some of those non-Western fantasy novels. And if you're a fan of those really robust novels that are looking at that romantasy element. If you have read it, I'd love to know more on your thoughts below in the comments. As always, I appreciate you paying attention to what I have to say about novels and the way that I interact and critique them. I'd love to know more about any of the books that you've read recently, and if there's anything I should check out that is similar to this or that you think I'd like more, I'd love to know about those down below. So until next time, I hope you have a fantastic 5-star read in your hands right now. Bye.